GCSE History Predicted Paper Walkthrough. This is day 3 of 7, and today's focus is on American West Paper B. Hopefully you've already watched the walkthroughs for American West Paper A and Elizabeth Paper A, and this is therefore your third video. Top tip: have a go at the questions before watching the video. All of the predicted papers for Paper 2 can be found on the whole cohort Google Classroom. Once you've had a go at the questions, use this video to self-assess your answers. Compare your answers to the model answers and use the marking criteria given to assess. There is not always one correct way of answering the questions. I've tried to cover as many as I possibly can, but other approaches may be valid, and if you're unsure, ask your teacher or ask me. Let's start with consequences. As a reminder, this is how your consequences are marked. Level 1 consequences provide a simple or generalised comment with generalised information about the topic with a limited knowledge and understanding. And level 2, which is what you're aiming for, is to analyse features of a period to explain a consequence, not just a comment, and providing specific information to show good knowledge and understanding. Our first consequence then is explain one consequence of Indigenous peoples of the Plains' attitudes to war. So there are 3 attitudes to war you need to know about in terms of Indigenous peoples' attitudes. So the first of these is the attitude that raiding is important for war. So for Indigenous peoples, raiding helps them gain valuable resources, especially horses. Many tribes think that horses have more horses than people. We then have counting coup. Now, counting coup is a way of fighting in which you try to touch your enemy or your opponent without being harmed or touched yourself. So this meant that warfare focused on bravery and skill. And then the third one, linked to counting coup, this belief or attitude that casualties in fighting should be avoided. This meant that tribes were better able to survive on the plains because they had more warriors available. For each of these attitudes and the consequence that links to the attitude, we also have that link to the wider West, which is essential for 4 out of 4. So for raiding, this increased tension because white Americans saw it as theft or criminal behaviour. Counting coup led to misunderstanding with white Americans because they didn't understand what was happening, and that led to harsher military action. And then avoiding casualties in fighting, this increased military pressure. Indigenous peoples were avoiding direct confrontation. They were just going for raids with limited men, and they were resisting white settlement. If you think about the 2 moments in the course where the white Americans achieve a 100% death rate, as in 100% of them died, it's Fetterman's Trap in Red Cloud's War and the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, and they both involve raids and surprise attacks, which links to that third attitude. So let's see what these look like as consequence paragraphs. So our first consequence is it allowed Indigenous peoples to gain valuable resources. So here's the paragraph for 4 marks. One consequence of Indigenous attitudes to war was that it helped Indigenous peoples gain valuable resources. During warfare, Indigenous peoples attempted to steal horses, which were extremely important for hunting buffalo, travel, and warfare on the plains. Successful raids also demonstrated bravery and skill, helping warriors gain respect and honour. This increased tension because white settlers viewed horse raiding as theft and criminal behaviour, while Indigenous peoples believed raiding was an accepted part of warfare. So in bold you have the reason identified, in italics you have your knowledge and understanding, and then underlined we have the explanation, the link to the wider West. It's increasing tension. Our second consequence then is that warfare ended up focusing on bravery and skill. As a reminder, it's explained one consequence. You only have to write about one of these. I'm just providing you with multiple options you could go for. You have one consequence of Indigenous attitudes to war was that Indigenous warfare often focused on bravery and honour. Indigenous warriors gained status by showing courage, such as touching an enemy in battle and escaping unharmed, known as counting coup. This was preferred to killing large numbers of enemies, as warriors were young men needed for hunting and survival. This led to misunderstanding with white Americans who viewed Indigenous peoples as savage or cowardly. and so the US government responded with harsher military action to crush indigenous resistance on the plains. So, reason identified, or consequence identified, factual information in italics, explanation and link to the wider West in underlined. Increases tension, leads to misunderstanding and harsher military action. Our final consequence then of the attitudes to war is that the tribes were better able to survive on the plains. Here's our paragraph. One consequence of indigenous attitudes to war was that tribes were better able to survive on the plains. Indigenous tribes wanted to avoid casualties in battle because losing too many warriors could weaken the whole tribe. Indigenous peoples often used quick raids and surprise attacks rather than large-scale battles, and only selected brotherhoods would go on a raid, which meant if a tribe lost, their casualties would be limited. This led to increased military pressure, as white American soldiers were trained to believe that a soldier should never run away. So they were frustrated that indigenous warriors avoided direct confrontation and continued to resist white settlement. And again, you could even refer to Red Cloud's War, Fetterman's Trap, and you could refer to the Battle of Little Bighorn as examples of this increasing military pressure and creating frustration amongst the white American soldiers. So that's how we would approach that question. Any one of those three consequences would do the job, get you 4 out of 4. Our other consequence question is explain one consequence of the closure of a permanent Indian frontier. Now, the specification now puts the permanent Indian frontier in, quote marks. So it's worth you remembering that so that you can write about it appropriately. You're not going to lose any marks if you forget the quote marks, but it's worth knowing that's how it would be presented. So there are 4 main consequences of a permanent closure of a permanent Indian frontier. As a reminder, the permanent Indian frontier was first set up in 1834 in the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act, dividing white America in the east from Indian Territory in the middle of America. So when it's closed in 1890, there are 4 main consequences. Firstly, it leads to a belief that manifest destiny had been fulfilled. Now, manifest destiny is the belief that white Americans should control the whole of America from coast to coast, and that came from God. Second consequence, a lot of indigenous independence. Our third consequence, it increased pressure to assimilate indigenous peoples. And finally, it led to the growth of settlement and new states. It's worth remembering, of course, that the largest Oklahoma land rush happens 3 years after the closure of a permanent Indian frontier, which links very nicely to that 4th consequence. Let's look at what these would look like as 4-mark consequence paragraphs. Our first consequence is the belief that manifest destiny had been fulfilled. Here's our paragraph. One consequence of the closure of the permanent Indian frontier was the belief that manifest destiny had been fulfilled. In 1890, the US Census Bureau officially declared that the frontier was closed because the West had been settled. Furthermore, new western states such as North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and Wyoming had been created, which reinforced the belief that white Americans had successfully controlled America from coast to coast. As a result, many Americans celebrated westward expansion as a success and ignored the damage caused to indigenous peoples, increasing support for further settlement and assimilation. So that bit which is underlined links to the wider West, says what happens next, and we've got lots of good detail in italics. Second consequence is the loss of indigenous independence. So a consequence might look like this. One consequence of the closure of the permanent Indian frontier was the loss of indigenous independence. By 1890, most indigenous peoples had been confined to reservations, and the US Army kept forts and troops around the reservations to maintain control. In addition, reservation land had been reduced and divided into individual plots, which meant indigenous peoples were increasingly dependent on government rations and rules on reservations. This led to the weakening of tribal authority and increased tension because many indigenous peoples resented losing control over their land and traditional ways of life. I'd argue that's less strong compared to the first consequence, but it would be a valid answer. I think you'd be better off by focusing on the impact on white settlers, though. Our third consequence, then, is increased pressure to assimilate indigenous peoples. So we'll start from the italics. Once the frontier was declared closed, the government believed there was no longer space for the traditional indigenous ways of life. Boarding schools had already banned indigenous languages and given children Christian names, while religious ceremonies such as the sun dance were outlawed. As a result, white American officials increased efforts to force indigenous peoples to adopt white American culture, religion, and farming methods, which increased tensions because indigenous cultures and traditional ways of life, had been deliberately destroyed. So that's a good 4-mark paragraph there. It's a good explanation linking to wider West, clear consequence, and good knowledge. And then finally, growth of settlement and new states. This is another strong consequence. This is as strong as the first consequence. So one consequence of the closure of a permanent Indian frontier was the growth of settlement and new states. The declaration that the frontier was closed encouraged more white Americans to move west because they believed indigenous resistance had been defeated and the land was now available for settlement. 7 Oklahoma land rushes took place after 1889, including the Great Land Rush of 1893, which opened 8 million acres of indigenous land to settlement. As a result, towns and states continued to grow across the plains, which increased tensions because even more indigenous land was taken from tribes and opened to white settlers. So a really strong one here, saying that it led to more settlement, new states, more indigenous land was now settled because that frontier had gone. So I would say for this question, consequence 1 and consequence 4 are your strongest consequence options here. 2 and 3 are okay, but they're not as strong. Let's look now at the narrative accounts. So as a reminder, here's how the narrative accounts are marked. You're looking for level 3. So material into a clear sequence of events leading to an outcome where the account of events analyses the linkage between them. So you need to make sure you have linking sentences which analyse the links between the beginning and the middle and the beginning and the end. And then accurate and relevant information with good knowledge and understanding. And if you do not address 3 or more aspects of content, the maximum mark out of 8 you can get is 5. So for example, if you only write about the 2 bullet points, you can't get 6 or more. Here's our question. Write a narrative account analysing changes in the cattle industry. You may use the following in your answer: Texas fever and the development of Abilene, but you must also use information of your own. I think there are 2 ways you can do this. Firstly, option 1. You can tell the story about how businessmen solve the cattle industry's problems to make profit. So you can divide your narrative into the problem, the solution, and the expansion. So the problem is there's huge demand for beef, but the Texas cattle are trapped by Texas fever restrictions. The solution is the Goodnight-Loving Trail and Abilene, getting the cattle to new places which don't go through Kansas, Missouri. And then the expansion, you've now then got ranching, which spreads onto the plains through John Illiff and open range ranching. That's option 1. Option 2 is slightly safer. It's about the key individuals. There are 3 key individuals you need to know about in this time period for the cattle industry, so it's worth knowing about our key individuals here. So we have Charles Goodnight, who opens the western markets, Joseph McCoy, who builds on that by linking cattle to the railroads by Abilene, and then John Illiff, who builds on McCoy by pioneering ranching on the plains. So I'm going to show you what each of these narratives would look like. Here's our first narrative then, option 1. So just to remind you, our overarching narrative is on the top right hand corner of your screen. Our first paragraph: after the Civil War, demand for beef grew rapidly because the population of American cities increased and more people could afford meat. However, although there were around 5 million longhorn cattle in Texas by 1865, ranchers struggled to get them to profitable markets such as Chicago. The quickest route north passed through Kansas and Missouri, but farmers there blocked Texas cattle because they feared Texas fever would infect their own animals. If you've got space, you could even write about the fact that a cow cost $5 in Texas but $40 in Chicago, which is why it's a profitable market. We then need our second paragraph, our middle, and we need a linking sentence. So here's our linking sentence in bold. As a result of the problems caused by Texas fever, ranchers needed new ways to transport and sell cattle. And then we have our content. In 1866, Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving drove 800 cattle from Texas to Fort Sumner in New Mexico, where they sold beef to the U.S. Army for $12,000. This created the Goodnight-Loving Trail and opened new western markets for Texas ranchers. Soon afterwards, Joseph McCoy developed Abilene after the railroad reached the town in 1867. McCoy used the Chisholm Trail to bring cattle to Abilene, built stockyards, and advertised the town across Texas. In 1867 alone, 35,000 cattle passed through Abilene, while around 3 million cattle used the town over the next 5 years. We've then got to link this to the end, which is Iliff and ranching. So, nice simple link here. Following the successes of these key individuals, the cattle industry expanded further onto the plains. John Iliff began ranching cattle near Denver using the open range system, where cattle grazed freely on unfenced public land. Iliff supplied beef to miners, railroad workers, and Sioux on reservations by 1868. By the early 1870s, he owned 16,000 acres of land and 26,000 cattle. Iliff proved that ranching could succeed directly on the plains without relying entirely on long cattle drives from Texas. As a result, the cattle industry expanded rapidly across the West and powerful cattle ranches began to develop. Always good to end your narrative on an outcome. The last sentence, the last paragraph is our outcome. And normally your outcome is either they lived happily ever after, which is in this case, or they didn't live happily ever after, which you'd see on a narrative about, for example, the Donner Party or the Great Die-Up. So that's option 1. Here's what option 2 looks like. And it's very similar to option 1, except we're missing out that first paragraph and splitting out Goodnight, McCoy and Iliff into 3 separate paragraphs. So if I show you the second paragraph, you can see how Goodnight and McCoy have been separated out rather than being put into the same paragraph. It means you just need to have a bit more knowledge. And then here's your Iliff paragraph. What's important here are the linking sentences. So one which links Goodnight to McCoy says, however, the Goodnight-Loving Trail mainly opened markets in the West, while many Texas ranchers still wanted access to a much bigger and more profitable markets in the East, especially Chicago. So that's our link between Goodnight and McCoy. And then our final link, while McCoy's success relied heavily on long drives from Texas, the next major change came from John Iliff, who proved that cattle could be raised directly on the plains instead. These are strong linking sentences because they directly reference the end of a previous paragraph, and they do it explicitly with named content. So if you want to pause the video here and read this narrative, that's absolutely fine, but I think option 1 is the better narrative. Let's move on to importance. So, looking again at level 3, you need analysis of importance with a line of reasoning that is coherent and logically structured, accurate and relevant information with good knowledge and understanding. Here are the 3 I've come up with. So we've got the importance of new farming methods on the plains for the success of homesteaders between 1862 and 76, the importance of manifest destiny for migration to the West, and the importance of US government policy 1835 to 62 for relations between the US government and the indigenous peoples of the plains. I don't think you'll get the second and third one on the same paper, to be honest with you, but I think you'd like to get one of them. Which one? Don't know. Let's start with our first question then, which is on new farming methods for the success of homesteaders. Importantly, the specification refers to both farming methods and farming technology. So while you could write about the use of barbed wire, that's an example of technology. You'd need to link that to a method, which is they're trying to protect their crops. In addition, the Desert Land Act, which you could link to irrigation, is in 1877. It is outside the dates in the question, but it does say C 1862 to C 1876, which means circa. So if you were desperate, you could use it because it's just outside and it's roughly within, but you have better examples. I think there are 4 reasons for importance you could write about. Number 1 is they were able to grow new crops. Importance number 2, planting trees or tree planting. Importance number 3, irrigation, when you're trying to get water for your land. And importance reason number 4, ploughing tough grassland. And here we'd reference the sulky plough, which is an example of technology, but we'd keep the paragraph focused on the method, which is ploughing tough grassland. So these are all new farming methods, and they affect the success of homesteaders. Let's look at the first one, growing new crops. So in bold we have a reason. One reason why new farming methods were important for the success of homesteaders was because settlers began growing crops better suited to the harsh environment. In italics we have our detail. Many early homesteaders struggled because crops such as corn did not grow well in the dry conditions of the plains. In the 1870s, some farmers began growing Turkey red wheat, which had been brought by Russian migrants and was better suited to the climate. We then have our explanation of importance, which is underlined. This made new farming methods important because homesteaders had a better chance of producing reliable harvests, feeding their families, and selling surplus grain for profit. Without Turkey red wheat, many homesteaders would be more likely to fail and abandon their claims. So a 2-sentence explanation. The second sentence starts with that word without, and that's the best way to explain importance. That's our first reason. Let's look at our second reason, which is tree planting. One reason why new farming methods were important for the success of homesteaders was because homesteaders tried to protect their crops by planting trees. The plains had few natural trees, which meant crops were exposed to strong winds and settlers lacked timber for building and fuel. The 1873 Timber Culture Act gave homesteaders another 160 acres of land if they promised to plant trees on a quarter of it, and these trees could act as windbreaks to shelter crops. This made new farming methods important because trees helped settlers adapt to the plains environment to farming and gave them more resources to survive. Without tree planting, homesteaders would have had less protection from the strong plains winds and fewer resources for building, fencing and fuel, making it harder to make their farms successful. So the focus is on how the planting trees help settlers to adapt to the plains environment. This is the new farming method in action, planting the trees, with specific reference to the 1873 Timber Culture Act, which incentivised tree planting. So you'd be fine with those 2 reasons, but if you want 2 more, here's one on irrigation. So one reason why new farming methods were important for the success of homesteaders was because settlers began using irrigation to make dry land more suitable for farming. Rainfall on the plains was unreliable, so crops could easily fail during dry periods. Homesteaders therefore tried to bring water to their land using the self-governing windmill, which pumped water from underground. In 1870, steel blades were added to the windmills, making them better able to cope with strong plains winds. This made new farming methods important because irrigation helped settlers adapt to a dry climate and made farming less dependent on rainfall alone. Without irrigation, many homesteaders would have struggled to grow enough crops to feed their families or sell for profit, making them more likely to abandon their claims. So the focus of this paragraph is on irrigation, not the self-governing windmill. So the focus is on the method, not the technology. And we've written this paragraph without referencing the Desert Land Act, which incentivised settlers to irrigate dry land. If you were risky, you could write about that, but it's in 1877, so don't take the risk if you don't need to. Finally, the final new farming method is ploughing tough grassland. So here's our paragraph. One reason why new farming methods were important for the success of homesteaders was because settlers had to learn how to break up tough prairie grassland. The plains were covered in thick grass with deep roots, which made it difficult to turn the land into farms. Homesteaders therefore needed to plough deeply and repeatedly before crops could be planted successfully. The sulky plough helped with this because it was a strong, ride-on steel plough that made breaking the prairie soil easier when using older walking ploughs. This made new farming methods important because ploughing tough grassland allowed settlers to make the land more productive for farming. Without ploughing, homesteaders may have owned land, but would have struggled to make it useful for growing crops. So that's how we would answer that question. 4 options, you only need 2. Next question. The importance of manifest destiny for migration to the West. I'd keep this really simple and just talk about 2 things. I would talk about how manifest destiny encouraged ordinary settlers to migrate west, and then how manifest destiny influenced government action that encouraged migration. So 1 paragraph on settlers, 1 paragraph on the government. You could say that manifest destiny justified taking indigenous land, and I would write about that if the question was the importance of manifest destiny for settlement to the West. However, we'll look and see how we can adapt it to migration. However, please just focus on your first 2. That will do absolutely fine for migration. For settlement, you can talk about indigenous land as well. We're going to look at all 3. First one is about encouraging ordinary settlers. So we've got our reason for importance in bold. 1 reason why manifest destiny was important for migration was because it encouraged ordinary settlers to believe moving west was their right and duty. In italics, we have lots of good evidence. Many white Americans believed they were meant to spread across the continent, bringing farming, Christianity, and civilization with them. This encouraged migrants to travel along routes such as the Oregon Trail, where around 400,000 migrants had travelled by 1869, and to move to California during the gold rush, when around 100,000 people travelled west by April 1849. And then our explanation of importance, 2 sentences. This made manifest destiny important because it was a powerful pull factor, making settlers risk the dangerous journey west in search of land, wealth, and opportunity. Without the belief in manifest destiny, fewer settlers may have been willing to see migration as a patriotic and worthwhile mission. So that's the impact of manifest destiny on settlers. Let's look next at how it influenced government action. So that is our first sentence in bold. We'll continue from the italics. The government wanted to strengthen American control over Western land, so it encouraged migration to places such as Oregon in the 1840s to support the US claim against Britain, financing John Fremont's mapping of the Oregon Trail. In 1862, this belief also helped shape policies such as the Homestead Act, which offered settlers 160 acres of land for $10, and the Pacific Railroad Act of 1862, which helped connect the East and West by rail. This made manifest destiny important because it turned the idea of westward expansion into practical support, making it easier for migrants to travel, claim land, and settle permanently. Without the belief in manifest destiny, the government would have seen it as less urgent to build railroads and encourage migration, making migration slower, harder, and less organised. Really easy here to focus on the government action on migration, but you've got to focus on manifest destiny. It's manifest destiny which gives the government the incentive and the urgency to support migration. And then our third option, that it justified taking indigenous land. Again, I would avoid this unless it said settlement instead of migration. But here's what we could say for a migration settlement. Not a settlement, a migration question. 1 reason why manifest destiny was important for migration was because it justified taking indigenous land and opening it up to migrants. Many white Americans believed they had a God-given right to expand across the continent, so indigenous rights to the land were ignored. For example, the 1830 Indian Removal Act forced thousands of indigenous peoples west of the Mississippi River, while the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty allowed white migrants to travel safely through indigenous lands. This made manifest destiny important because it removed or weakened indigenous resistance to migration routes, allowing more migrants to travel west with government protection and support. Without the belief in manifest destiny, the US government may have found it harder to justify pushing indigenous peoples aside to make migration west possible. So the focus on this paragraph is very much about migration, allowing more migrants to travel rather than settling and taking the land. So if you're going to do this, focus on migration. Final question. The importance of early US government policy for relations between the US government and the indigenous peoples of the plains. We've already referenced some of this as part of Manifest Destiny, which is why I don't think they ask the second and the third importance questions on the same paper. So we start with the Indian Removal Act 1830, which is moving indigenous peoples west of the Mississippi River. We then have the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act 1834, which sets up the permanent Indian frontier. Then the 1840s, Texas, Oregon, and California become US territory, and this makes Indian territory into an obstruction. The permanent Indian frontier is now obsolete. So the Indian Appropriations Act is created in 1851, which gives government funding to put indigenous peoples onto reservations, and then in order to keep relations cordial, they agreed the first Fort Laramie Treaty, which allows indigenous peoples to stay on areas of territory. However, as you should know, this doesn't go quite to plan. Then in 1862, you have the Homestead Act and the Pacific Railroad Act. But because they could ask this question 1835 to 51, we're going to ignore the Homestead Act and Pacific Railroad Act for now. We're just going to focus on the Permanent Indian Frontier and the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act. Even though the Act is in 1834, the Permanent Indian Frontier has a significant impact after that year, from 1835. So it's worth talking about. We'll then talk about the Indian Appropriations Act, and then we'll talk about the first Fort Laramie Treaty. So, our first reason for importance is the Permanent Indian Frontier and the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act. So our paragraph is, one reason why US government policy was important for relations with indigenous peoples was because the Permanent Indian Frontier attempted to separate indigenous peoples from white Americans. In 1834, the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act created a boundary between Indian territory and white American land in the east, guarded by US Army forts. White settlers were banned from settling in Indian territory, and traders were banned from selling guns and alcohol to indigenous peoples. This made government policy important because it showed that relations were based on separation and control rather than genuine cooperation. Without the permanent Indian frontier, there may have been even more immediate conflict between white settlers and indigenous peoples because there would have been no clear boundary separating white settlers from Indian territory. So, ignore the question at the top. It says Fort Laramie Treaty. It shouldn't say Fort Laramie Treaty. It should be the US government policy. So that's our paragraph. Our next one then is Indian Appropriations Act 1851 as the importance of government policy. The one reason why US government policy was important for relations with indigenous peoples was because the 1851 Appropriations Act began the move towards the reservation system. The Act provided money to move indigenous peoples onto areas of land called reservations, which were managed by the US government. Indigenous peoples were encouraged to live more like white Americans by farming, although reservations still included some hunting lands. This made government policy important because relations shifted from separation to greater government control over indigenous land and movement. Without the Indian Appropriations Act, indigenous peoples would have had more freedom to continue their traditional nomadic lifestyle across the plains for longer. So, Appropriations Act leads to greater control. And again, it's with that question there, the importance of US government policy, rather than the importance of the Fort Laramie Treaty. Here's our final option then for this question. So one reason why US government policy was important for relations with indigenous peoples was because the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1851 created a closer relationship. Indigenous peoples agreed to stay within fixed areas of territory, allow white settlers to travel through their lands, and accept US Army forts and troops. In return, The US government promised to protect indigenous peoples from white settlers and pay a $50,000 annuity if the terms of the treaty were kept. This made government policy important because the treaty increased the government's involvement in indigenous life and made indigenous peoples more dependent on government promises. Without the Fort Laramie Treaty, indigenous peoples would have remained more independent from the US government because they would have not been tied to fixed territories, army forts, or annuity payments that increased government control over their lives. So for a question about the importance of early government policy, those are the three things you'd want to talk about. You'd talk about the Permanent Indian Frontier, the Indian Appropriations Act, and the first Fort Laramie Treaty. That brings an end to the day 3 of 7 predicted paper walkthrough for American West Paper B. Hopefully you found it useful. Hopefully you've been able to watch the video and compare your answers to the model answers provided. Happy revising. See you later.